Her father's courthouse steps baked under the noon sun, and the smell of dust and sweat mixed in the heavy summer air. Clara had seen the chain gang before, but never like this. Lined up along Main Street for everyone to watch, iron collars glinting, wrists raw from rubbing metal. They were shackled 2 by 2, their striped clothes hanging loose on starved frames, a deputy keeping watch with a shotgun tucked against his hip. She tried to keep walking, clutching the basket of fresh bread she was taking to the schoolhouse. But then she saw him. Third in line, his head lowered against the glare, was a man whose face she had only seen once before. 6 years ago, in the shadow of the churchyard, when he had pressed a book back into her hands and thanked her for teaching him to read. Back then he'd been younger, cleaner, but the sharp lines of his jaw and the deep-set eyes were the same. He looked up now, and for an instant, recognition flickered. His lips formed her name without sound. Clara's pulse jumped. The deputy shifted, glancing between them, suspicion narrowing his gaze. She hurried forward, forcing herself to look away, but the memory gnawed at her. The winter she had found him wounded in the barn, her quiet lessons by lantern light, the promise she made never to speak of it. The bread felt heavier in her arms. Half an hour later, she should have been at the schoolhouse. Instead, she stood in the sheriff's barn, staring at the small brass key hanging on a nail by the tack hooks. Through the half-open door, she could see the chain gang drinking from a trough, the outlaw's wrists still bound, water dripping from his chin. She told herself to leave, that it was madness, that her father would disown her. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her, a mixture of shame, gratitude, and a question he didn't dare ask. Her hand moved before she thought. The key was cold in her palm as she stepped into the sunlight, her skirt catching on the doorway. The deputy's back was turned. The outlaw's eyes locked on hers. She knelt, pretending to fix her shoe, and in one swift motion slid the key into his shackles. The click was barely audible, but his fingers twitched with sudden freedom. "Go," she mouthed. He didn't move. Then the deputy barked something, turned his head, and in that moment, the man was gone, melting into the alley with the chains dangling loose from one wrist. Clara stood, heart pounding, certain she'd just destroyed her life. She didn't know that she'd just saved his, and that years later he would repay her in a way no one in the territory would ever forget. By evening, word was spreading faster than the dust storm rolling in from the west. One of the chain gang men had escaped. Clara sat rigid at the kitchen table, the basket of bread untouched beside her, the ticking of the wall clock hammering in her ears. Her father had left in a rush the moment he heard, his black robe flapping as he stormed toward the jail. She told herself no one could possibly know. She'd been careful, quick. But when a heavy knock rattled the front door, her stomach twisted. The sheriff's voice came through, low and gravelly, asking for Judge Harlan. Her father wasn't home. Clara opened the door only a crack, but the sheriff leaned into the gap, his eyes searching her face like a dog sniffing for guilt. "Funny thing," he said. "The fella that slipped those irons today, he didn't run for the hills. Someone said they saw him near the old schoolhouse road." He paused. "That's your way home, ain't it, Miss Clara?" She forced a polite smile, shaking her head. "I was at the schoolhouse all afternoon," she lied smoothly, but her palms were slick. The sheriff's gaze dropped to the small smear of rust on her sleeve. Chain dust she hadn't noticed. He said nothing about it, only tipped his hat and warned her to be careful walking alone, then left. As soon as the door shut, she pressed her back to it, her legs trembling. That night she barely slept, every creak of the house making her think of boots on the porch. By morning, the escaped outlaw was all anyone talked about. Storekeepers locked their doors early, and children were called home from chores before dusk. But Clara's mind was elsewhere, on the hills beyond town, where the outlaw might be hiding, hungry, hunted. She didn't know why it mattered so much. Then, 3 nights after the escape, she found her answer. She woke to a faint sound outside, like someone tapping the window frame. Heart pounding, she pulled on her robe and crept to the glass. The moonlight caught on something hanging from the latch. A small leather pouch. She eased the window open and pulled it inside. Inside the pouch was a single folded paper, smudged with dirt but written in a careful, familiar hand. "Owe you my life. Will repay in full. Wait for me." Beneath it, wrapped in cloth, was a silver dollar and a crude wooden carving of a book, the same shape she'd once used to teach him the alphabet. Her throat tightened. She clutched the carving until her knuckles whitened, knowing this was far from over. Somewhere out there, a man with a debt to her name was planning something she could not yet imagine. A week later, Clara's days had returned to a fragile routine. Morning lessons at the schoolhouse, afternoons helping her father's clerk with court papers, evenings pretending nothing had changed. But the leather pouch never left her apron pocket, and each time her fingers brushed the wooden book inside, her pulse quickened. She told herself he was gone for good, but part of her wasn't sure she wanted that to be true. The morning was brisk when she unlocked the schoolhouse door and stepped inside, her breath clouding in the cool air. The scent of chalk and old pine was familiar, comforting, until she noticed the back door was unlatched. Every muscle tensed. She set her satchel down quietly and reached for the iron poker by the stove. "Don't," a voice said softly from the shadows. She froze. He stepped forward slowly, no longer in prison stripes but in a patched buckskin coat, his dark hair tied back. The outlaw, Luke, she remembered now, looked thinner but stronger, his eyes alert and steady. He raised his hands in peace. "You freed me. I said I'd repay it. I'm starting now." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't be here. My father—" "Ain't for your father," he interrupted gently, pulling something from the satchel slung over his shoulder. It was a stack of old, leather-bound books, geography, history, readers. "Found these in the ruins of a ranch house. You'll need 'em." She stared at him, confused. "For what?" Luke glanced around the empty room, then back at her. "Your school. You've got 12 desks and maybe 6 students. I'm gonna change that." The words didn't make sense. How could a hunted man think about school children? She started to tell him to leave, but heavy boots clattered on the porch outside. Luke moved faster than thought, crossing the room in 3 strides and slipping through the back door without a sound. A heartbeat later, the sheriff's broad frame filled the doorway. "Morning, Miss Clara. You seen anything unusual round here?" His eyes swept the room. Her heart thumped hard against her ribs. "Only the usual," she replied evenly, forcing her hands to stay loose at her sides. The sheriff lingered, studying her for a beat longer, then nodded and left. Clara locked the door and sagged against it. Luke was gone, but the stack of books remained on the front desk, their covers worn but their pages whole. She ran her hand over the top one, her mind racing. She didn't know what he was planning, but now she knew he meant it. He'd come back for her, and for something far bigger than just a debt. 2 mornings later, Clara was ringing the school bell when she noticed movement on the ridge beyond the wheat field. At first, she thought it was a pair of deer, but as the shapes drew closer, her breath caught. 2 children, a boy and a girl, in ragged clothes, barefoot despite the cold. They stopped at the gate, eyes wide, clutching small bundles wrapped in flour sacks. Clara hurried toward them. "Are you lost?" she asked, but the boy shook his head. "He said you'd take us," the girl murmured, glancing over her shoulder toward the ridge. Clara followed her gaze and caught the faintest flicker of movement. Luke, leaning against a tree, just visible before he melted back into the pines. The children's faces were pinched with hunger, their skin pale. She ushered them inside, stoking the stove's fire until it roared, then laid out bread and milk from her basket. They ate in silence, eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to send them away. "You're safe here," Clara said quietly, though her own heart was pounding. By mid-morning, 3 more children arrived, this time escorted by an old man with a limp who left without a word. Each one repeated the same thing. "He said you'd take us." Clara didn't need to ask who he was, but with each new arrival, dread coiled tighter in her stomach. 5 extra mouths to feed, all unregistered with the county. Her father would hear of it by sundown. Sure enough, just as she dismissed the class, his carriage rolled up in a storm of dust. Judge Harlan stepped down, his face dark with fury. "Explain yourself," he demanded, pointing at the children still huddled by the stove. Clara lifted her chin. "They need a place to learn, to eat. I couldn't turn them away." His voice was like a whip. "You think you can hide strays here without consequence? Do you know where they came from? Who they belong to?" She didn't flinch. "I know they were cold and hungry. That's enough for me." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "This isn't charity, Clara. It's law. And law says these children are someone's property until proven otherwise." The words chilled her. She glanced at the boy and girl by the gate, their thin hands clasped together. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Luke was out there, sending them to her like fragile promises. She realized then that whatever he was doing, it was putting both of them on a collision course with her father, the sheriff, and the law itself. The next afternoon, the sound of boots on the schoolhouse porch made Clara's stomach twist. She'd been expecting her father, but when she opened the door, it was Sheriff Doolin, hat in hand, his eyes scanning the room behind her. "Afternoon, Miss Clara," he said, his voice low but not unkind. "Mind if I step in?" She nodded warily, and he crossed the threshold, glancing at the children bent over their slates. "Heard you've had some new faces in class," he said, almost conversational, but there was weight in the words. Clara stayed still. "I take whoever wants to learn." The sheriff's gaze lingered on a boy with a bruised cheek. "Trouble is, these ain't just strays. 2 of them match the descriptions of runaways from the Weller place. Man like Weller doesn't let property walk away without a fight." Clara's jaw tightened. "They're children, Sheriff, not property." He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Between you and me, I don't much like Weller either. But law's law. If I can find him, so can he." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "You know a man named Luke Carter?" The name landed like a stone in her chest. "I don't," she lied smoothly, but her fingers curled against her skirt. "Funny," Doolin said, "because someone spotted him near the old quarry with a pack mule and 3 more kids. He's wanted for chain gang escape, and now they're saying kidnapping." Clara forced a laugh. "You think I'd be hiding an outlaw here?" The sheriff's eyes softened just a fraction. "I think you're a good woman, Clara, and good women can get themselves tangled up in bad men's plans. If Carter shows himself here again, you tell me first. Might save your neck." He touched his hat brim and left, leaving the warning hanging like smoke in the air. As soon as his boots faded down the road, Clara moved to the back window. Far up the ridge, barely visible in the fading light, a figure stood still as stone. Luke, watching. He didn't wave, didn't call out, but she felt the connection just the same. He'd heard the sheriff was closing in, and had come to see for himself that she was still safe. But safety wasn't the right word anymore. With each child he sent her way, she was walking deeper into his fight. And now the law was watching both of them. The wind rattled the schoolhouse shutters, but it wasn't the weather that woke Clara. A soft tap at the back door pulled her from sleep, her cot creaking as she rose. She hesitated only a moment before unbolting it, and Luke slipped inside like a shadow, his coat damp from the mist. He didn't speak at first, just scanned the room, his eyes settling on the pile of blankets where the children slept in a corner. "You've kept them safe," he said quietly, his voice rough from the cold. "For now," she whispered back, crossing her arms. "The sheriff came. He knows you're here." Luke's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Doolin's got a better heart than he lets on. He won't be the first to find me." He set down a sack, and when she peeked inside, she saw jars of beans, sacks of flour, a wedge of hard cheese. "Where did you—" "From the ghost line," he cut in. "An old trail between ranches. I've been using it to move the kids." He crouched beside the stove, adding wood to the coals until the room warmed. "These children, they're from places like Weller's, like the rail camps. I'm not just hiding them. I'm moving them to families that won't treat them like stock." Clara stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "That's why you keep sending them here. You're using my school as a way station." He met her gaze evenly. "You're the only one in this valley who won't turn them in. They trust you, and I need you to trust me." She shook her head, torn between admiration and fear. "You can't keep doing this. My father—" "Your father will call me a criminal no matter what I do," Luke said sharply. Then, softer, "But you know I'm right. If I stop, those kids go back to chains." A small whimper broke their standoff, the youngest girl shifting in her sleep, clutching the hem of Clara's skirt, even in dreams. Luke's eyes softened at the sight. "I'll be gone before dawn. 3 more are coming tomorrow night. After that, we'll have to move you too." The words sent a shiver through her. "Move me? If the law ties you to me, they'll crush you right along with me," he said, pulling on his gloves. "I won't let that happen." Before she could answer, he was gone into the mist, leaving behind the scent of wood smoke and the sound of her heart pounding in the silence. The morning started with the sound of carriage wheels crunching over frost. Clara had just rung the bell when her father's voice cut through the yard like a whip. "Inside, now." The children froze at their desks as Judge Harlan stepped in, his black coat swallowing the light from the doorway. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. Clara moved to block the stove, where the youngest children huddled. "Father." "Don't father me," he snapped, his eyes sweeping over the crowded room. "This is no school anymore. It's a harbor for thieves." He pointed at a boy with bandaged wrists. "That one belongs to Weller. And that one," his finger jabbed toward a pale girl, "was reported missing from a rail camp in Carson." Clara kept her voice steady. "They belong to no one. They're children, not chattel." His face hardened. "The law says otherwise. You will dismiss them by sundown, or I'll have this building shuttered and every child here taken into custody." A gasp rippled through the room. Clara stepped forward, her skirts brushing the toes of his polished boots. "If you take them back, they'll be beaten, worked to death. You know it." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You've let sentiment blind you, Clara. The law is the spine of this territory. Break it, and we are no better than the men we despise." She clenched her fists. "Then maybe the law needs breaking." A murmur rose from the children, and her father's jaw tightened. One day you'll see that this outlaw Carter is using you, and when he's gone, all you'll have left is a ruined name." He turned sharply towards the door. "Sundown, Clara. Make your choice." The deputies followed him out, their boots thudding heavy against the porch. Clara stood frozen until she heard the carriage wheels fade, then dropped into the nearest chair. The room was silent except for the crackle of the stove. Every pair of eyes was on her, trusting, afraid, waiting. She looked at the youngest girl, still clutching the hem of her skirt, and knew there was no choice at all. Somewhere out in the pines, Luke was still moving pieces on his invisible board. But if they were going to survive the day, she would have to make her own move, one that would put her directly against her father and the law. Clara waited until the children were bent over their slates, pretending to work, before she slipped to the back room where the coal bucket sat. Her hands trembled as she pulled a small scrap of paper from her apron and scribbled quickly in pencil. "Sundown. Deputies coming. Must move all before then." She folded it twice, then once more, and slid it into a tin of matches at the bottom of the coal. Luke had told her once, in passing, that the coal deliveries were his eyes and ears in town. His cousin handled the wagon, and if anything was tucked inside, Luke would get it within an hour. She carried the bucket to the porch, setting it just inside the open door where the morning chill spilled in. A moment later, Mrs. Denning from the store came up the path, her shawl pulled tight. "Morning, Clara," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid to be seen. "Coal boy's running late, but he'll be by before noon." Clara gave her a small nod, confirmation enough, and returned to her post at the stove. Every tick of the clock after that felt like a hammer in her chest. By midday, the clatter of the coal wagon reached her ears. She caught only a glimpse of the driver, a wiry young man with Luke's eyes, before he tipped the bucket into his cart and drove off without a word. The message was gone. All she could do now was wait. The hours stretched thin. Each time a child coughed or the floorboard creaked, Clara's mind jumped to the image of her father's deputies storming through the door. She kept them busy with recitations, arithmetic, anything to keep their eyes on her instead of the growing fear in the room. The sun had just begun to slip toward the tree line when she heard it, a low whistle from the pines beyond the schoolyard. The children's heads lifted like startled deer. Clara's heart leapt. Luke was close. Too close. She stepped outside, pretending to fetch water, and spotted movement between the trees. Luke emerged, dressed in dark wool, leading 2 pack mules. His face was set, but his eyes locked on hers with a silent question. "Are you ready?" Clara gave the barest nod. Sundown was minutes away, and the deputies would already be saddling their horses. If Luke was going to spirit the children away, it had to happen now. And it had to be flawless. Luke didn't waste time with words. He swung down from his mule and handed Clara a bundle of rough-spun cloaks. "Get them covered, no faces showing." Clara moved fast, draping each child and whispering instructions. No talking, no crying, no matter what they heard. The older boys tightened the ties, clutching the smaller one's hands. Outside, the last orange light of day bled into the snow, and the sound of hooves was already drifting from town. Deputies. Luke led the first group toward the tree line, his steps silent on the frozen ground. Clara kept glancing back at the schoolhouse, knowing every second put them closer to discovery. She returned for the second group just as the first faint shouts carried on the wind. Luke's jaw flexed. "They're moving faster than I thought." He signaled to the mules, which were loaded with supplies and bedrolls, then took the smallest girl into his arms without breaking stride. They slipped into a narrow gully hidden by spruce, the snow muffling their movements. The children stumbled over roots, but Luke's voice stayed low and steady, guiding them on. Almost there. Just breathe. Behind them, the sound of riders grew louder, her father's voice among them, shouting orders. Clara's stomach twisted, but she pushed the last child into the cover of the gully and dropped to her knees, wiping away the line of footprints with a pine branch. By the time she caught up, the group was crossing a frozen creek, the moonlight turning the ice to glass. Luke crouched by the bank, listening. "They'll hit the school in minutes," he murmured. "When they find it empty, they'll sweep the woods." He pointed to a dark rise ahead. "We go over that ridge to the ghost line. From there, we split, half with me, half with my cousin. 2 trails, no pattern." Clara's breath came in clouds, her boots soaked through, but she nodded. She knew what splitting meant. If one group was caught, the other might make it. A crack of gunfire split the night. One of the older boys flinched, nearly slipping on the ice. Luke caught him, pressing him forward. "Don't stop. Not now." They climbed the ridge, the forest swallowing them, the deputies' shouts fading behind. At the top, Luke paused just long enough to meet Clara's eyes. "This is the part where we don't look back." And then they were running again, deeper into the wild, the children's breath ragged but unbroken, carrying them toward the only chance they had left. The moon rode high when the ridge finally gave way to a wide, slow-moving river. Mist clung to its surface, curling around the willows like ghostly fingers. Luke stopped at the bank, scanning the opposite shore. A faint glow burned in the distance, a cabin lantern, swaying gently. "That's my cousin," he said. "Other groups already inside." The children huddled close, shivering under their cloaks. Clara's arms ached from carrying the youngest boy, but she tightened her grip when he whimpered. "Almost there," she whispered, though her voice was frayed. Luke led the mules down the slope, their hooves crunching ice along the bank, then waded into the shallows without hesitation. The water reached his thighs, black and biting, but he moved steadily, one child at a time clinging to him as he ferried them across. Clara followed, teeth chattering, her skirts heavy and dragging. When the last child was safely on the far shore, Luke guided them toward the cabin. The door opened before they reached it, spilling warm light across the snow. A tall woman with strong eyes stepped out, pulling children inside 2 at a time. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Inside, the air smelled of stew and wood smoke. The smallest ones were sat near the hearth, blankets thrown over their shoulders. Clara eased down beside them, her knees giving way. She looked across the room at Luke, who stood with his cousin, speaking in low tones. His eyes found hers, steady and sure, and she realized he'd risked everything tonight, not just for the children, but for her. The sound of distant hooves faded into the night. Her father would know by now. He would come looking, and when he did, the girl he'd raised to honor the law would be standing against him. The thought should have filled her with dread. Instead, she felt lighter than she had in years. Luke crossed the room, kneeling so they were eye level. "This isn't the end," he said quietly, "but it's a start. We'll keep them safe. We'll keep teaching." His voice softened. "You did more than save them tonight, Clara. You gave them a future." She looked around, their small hands gripping spoons, their faces finally unguarded, and felt something settle inside her. She'd built a school once. She could build it again. Only this time, it wouldn't stand under her father's shadow. Outside, the river kept moving, carrying the night away. And in the glow of that cabin, surrounded by the children she refused to give up, Clara knew she had crossed her own line forever, and there was no going back.